The Miles Mathis Phenomenon Evaluated. Bruce Charlton. I first heard of Miles Mathis, who has two very large websites on science, mostly physics, and on other stuff, especially cultural critique, but also the arts, literature, media etc. because several people sent me links to his fanfiction follow-up to The Lord of the Rings. I didn't like this fanfic, and could only manage to read a few pages, but went on to browse his other productions, and began to notice a few references to Miles Mathis here and there in my corner of the internet. It seems that Miles Mathis is something of a phenomenon in terms of his productivity, range, and stylistic extremism. Therefore, someone worth a second look, and deserving of some attention. Since then, I have read through scores of his essays and other productions. These are attention-grabbing by their outrageousness of vehemence and claims, and broadly appealing to my socio-political sensibilities, but I was also trying to discern whether there was value in them. On the basis that, as Chesterton stated, to understand a man we need to know his philosophy, and knowing his philosophy is a key to understanding everything important about him. This was not easy, because I find the Miles Mathis persona, i.e. his written personality, very irritating and grating. He writes as a tremendously pretentious and domineering character, a particular type of self-assertive, boastful yet emotionally brittle individual, who is relatively common in university circles, but who I would avoid interacting with in real life, and in print. Setting that personality aversion aside, what is my evaluation? Perhaps surprisingly, I think Miles Mathis's best work is his science. I'm not saying he is right, or indeed wrong, in his particular theories and claims, because his field of concern is not mine, and I am unable to evaluate specifics. But, from the overall impression and from many small details, I recognize the mental workings and truth-seeking commitment of a real scientist doing real science. This is rare, especially in physics, which has been corrupted for longer than any other branch of science. And it means that Mathis has a chance of being right or on the right lines, whereas the overwhelming majority of those in official science have zero chance of being right, since they are merely professional research bureaucrats who are not even trying to seek or speak the truth. The rest of Mathis's output can be divided into criticism, critique, and depictions of his visual artworks. The visual artwork strikes me as good quality commercial art/illustration, and I am unsurprised that he can, apparently, make a living from doing it. But, judged as art, it is spiritually empty at best, and sometimes it is nasty and evil tending. The sense of queasiness and repulsion induced by some of Miles Mathis's art is mirrored in the effect of much of the writing, and in his self-satisfied, unopposed, pridefully affirmed, multiply defended, egotism. He deploys the kind of ranting aggressive manner associated with the later Nietzsche in his Antichrist phase. I mean the Nietzsche whose chapter headings in his last, pre-totally insane from syphilis dementia, book Ecce Homo include Why I Am So Clever, Why I Am So Wise, and Why I Write Such Excellent Books. This is a manner which, I believe, emanates from someone who lacks a coherent metaphysics and who knows it unconsciously, and wants to keep that knowledge unconscious. One who has excluded the necessary assumptions from which he could, in principle, discern, critique and advocate values, yet continues to engage in making multiple, quasi-objective, value affirmations and rejections. In other words, an aggressive assertiveness that brooks no resistance is, it seems to me, the characteristic effect and affectation of a moralist whose deepest beliefs are nihilistic. It is approximately in-your-face confidence and fluency, overlying an implicit and unacknowledged/denied conviction of ultimate emptiness, futility, despair. This is my diagnosis of the many essays focused upon explaining the calculated fakery and manipulation in service to evil that is mainstream modern culture and discourse. I, of course, agree that mainstream modern West is indeed dishonest and evil, I would say more so than at any time or place in human history. Mathis, by contrast, regards all of history as essentially the same, always bad in the same way as now, and he never seems to discuss the development of human consciousness. But my explanations are rooted in a belief in God and that we dwell in a divine creation, and that this mortal world is inhabited by spiritual entities, which include the supernatural evil of immortal demons who oppose God's will and divine creation, and whose ultimate goal is the damnation of souls. Whereas Mathis explains the characteristic evils of this mortal world in terms of secular materialism, in terms of a selfish and self-gratifying tribalism that holds together, increases and extends throughout millennia of human history. Thus he, like the late Nietzsche, is focused on genealogy, on the lineages of heredity and ideology of the evil establishment. This, to my mind, self-contradictorily entails that Miles Mathis posits an extreme degree of multi-generational purpose, planning and organization, and a sustained and developing global networking. Yet such massive cooperation and coordination is posited as happening among people who are, by the same theories, most deeply motivated by their own selfish lusts. In other words, Miles Mathis's theories posit ultra-selfishness and self-indulgence, with simultaneously the greatest imaginable degree of long-termist systematic teamwork. This I regard as an impossible combination for mortal and temporary human beings, although exactly what would be expected from immortal demons. When I looked at the detail of Mathis's specific essays on specific cultural and artistic or literary topics, even when I agreed with his general conclusions, which was quite often, it was evident that most were only very superficially researched and understood, and that the argument method and mode was stereotyped, mechanical, and vastly overgeneralized, such that anything at all could be proved or refuted using them. I was kept reading when my agreement or relative ignorance led my mood to be dominated by my negative pleasure at reading unrestrained and deft rubbishing of things I felt needed to be rubbished. But when it came to serious matters, and especially to matters of core values and the proper motivations to a good man in this world of evil lies, well, there was nothing there. Furthermore, when I knew the subject matter, the arguments were, in many cases, full of errors and arbitrary false assumptions, including mistakes in exactly those aspects upon which the argument depends. Overall, therefore, I find Miles Mathis to be someone who has good surface instincts, but, because of his God-rejecting, creation-rejecting, anti-spiritual heart, has ended up indirectly working for the wrong side in the spiritual war of this world. Once the excitement of his prose and persona have worn off, what is left is merely the same fear, resentment, despair and nihilism that characterize the West in these days. Reading Miles Mathis in quantity or with attention, therefore tends to induce exactly the same mindset that the demonic spirits most desire to induce in the people of this world, and which they propagate by their human agents of fake liberation, globalist totalitarianism, and spiteful destructiveness of all that is good. As for Mathis himself, somewhat as with Nietzsche, his position is so extreme in its surface depths incoherence, that its inherent contradictions make it unstable. It is this incipient instability which is being self-concealed by the self-distractions of externally directed ranting aggressiveness. But I feel that Mathis may, sooner or later, and perhaps post-mortally, eventually choose to cure these inner contradictions, by adopting metaphysical assumptions that make sense of his superficial opposition to the lies and exploitations of this modern world. That is, Miles Mathis is a pretty strong candidate for choosing theism and Christianity, as soon as he applies his intelligence to fundamental matters of life, death and eternity, with the same diligence he applies it to the phenomena of this world. On the other hand, Miles Mathis could choose to flip the other way. If he holds onto his nihilism, it will infect and permeate his superficial opinions, and he will gravitate to the swelling ranks of pseudo-radicalism, of controlled opposition, of those who deeply endorse the core assumptions of this evil world, while publicly fussing over the morality of meaninglessly specific details. Why is destruction of Western nations the priority for the demonic powers of purposive evil? Bruce Charlton. Why is destruction of Western nations the priority for the demonic powers of purposive evil? It clearly is. The demonic powers are in control, the global establishment leadership and multi-billionaire class are puppets, and the Western masses are controlled. And the West is being encouraged to destroy itself economically, financially, by mass immigration, political correctness, climate change and pseudo-environmentalism, Birdemic peck healthism. And now, the intention is, by gratuitously provoking and escalating a mega-killing war against the global South and East. But why are the non-Western nations apparently exempted from this imposed suicide cult? Because, since early 2022, the world has split, the West is increasingly isolated, and the rest of the world is incrementally, week by week, stepping off the establishment constructed down escalator to deliberate auto-annihilation. Exactly because the leadership class and Western masses are oblivious to the world historical scale of unfolding events, and because they continue to ramp up the self-destructive policies all round, I feel sure that this prioritizing of Western nations for the chop is a deliberate demonic strategy, happening by intent. There are, no doubt, multiple factors at work, but behind it will be something simple, clear, comprehensible, and spiritual, that is being directed purposively against the West. It is, we can infer, extremely important to supernatural evil, to those spiritual powers that seek man's damnation, that the West be brought to abandon, and turn against Christianity, and to embrace the value inversions of secular left modernity. And the Western nations, their leaders and especially managerial/intellectual classes, are not merely willing, but indeed actively keen, thus to fall in line with the demonic agenda. With the exception, so far, of the Fire Nation, which is why it has become public enemy number one for the West. Of the other breakaway nations of the East and South, I don't see any that threaten the eventual victory of the demonic perspective. They are non-Christian, they are developing in a convergent materialist manner, they have not learned the lessons that the West failed to learn, and would be expected to fall into the demonic clutches later if not sooner. So, I assume that the real, supernatural, demonic, strategists of the world are making the best, from their damnation-intending point of view, of the current situation, by using the breakaway of the East and South to concentrate their efforts on the West. They can now accelerate the self-destroying policies in the West, with even less opposition than before February 2022, including mobilizing majority Western support for morally scapegoating all the East and Southern nations who dissent from, or delay, aggressive and immediate implementation of the agenda of evil. Destruction of the West has always been the priority, now it can be achieved even faster and more completely. The rest of the world can wait. The Decline of the Western Empire, This Philip K. Dick World. Bruce Charlton. It is quite staggering to watch the purposive suicide of the Western global empire that has ruled for many generations, a change in the world that is greater than that of 1989-90 and perhaps greater than any since the 1914-18 war, which I regard as including the Russian Revolution. What staggers me is that, apparently, hardly anybody in the Western Empire has even noticed this rapid collapse. And nearly all of those who do notice, misinterpret, minimize, misunderstand to the point of inversion. The reason is familiar to those who have engaged with the dystopian totalitarian world of Philip K. Dick, in which the very strength to control everything is a cause of self-destruction. To put matters simply, the establishment leadership have developed a monolithic Western global mass media which is integrated into the system of surveillance and governance, and to which the masses are addicted. Since the global coup of 2020, this mainstream mass media has become fully controlled in its major issue content, and dissenting mass sources have been blocked, demonized and crushed. As of now, the masses know/believe/act upon only that which is establishment filtered, interpreted, and disseminated. So when, as early last year, the system embarks on course of, supposedly, externally directed sanctions that, contrary to the expressed intent, had immediate and, objectively, catastrophic self-destructive, disempowering effects, this actuality was blocked, explained away, and inverted by the mass media. The effects are unavoidable, will be catastrophic, but will not be noticed. Because unnoticed, therefore it will not be understood, therefore there is zero possibility of recognizing error and reversing a disastrous course. In other words, it is precisely the totalitarian power of the establishment, to control minds, that enables, and indeed doubles down on, actively self-destructive policies, because knowledge of effects are now, because of totalitarianism, detached from their causes. Note, the above analysis is merely materialistic, and, even worse, implicitly assumes that the physical suicide of the West's socio-military economic power is spiritually a bad thing for the world. I am here merely trying to explain a mechanism by which an apparently all-powerful regime can, because of its power, destroy itself without even knowing it is doing so. 3 immediate psychological benefits of becoming a Christian, specifically. Bruce Charlton. 1 doesn't become a Christian as a means to the end of enjoying a happier mortal life here on earth. Christianity is true, and that is the reason why we ought to believe it. The psychological, as well as the cosmic/supernatural, benefits of Christianity are available only to those for whom it is reality. Yet, for someone who starts out as a typical mainstream modern atheist/agnostic materialist, there are at least 3 immediate psychological benefits from being a Christian. The background of mainstream modern materialism, MMM, which is explicitly taught us by public and official discourse in the mass media, education system, academia and science, and, especially, is assumed and implicit in the innumerable communications of state and corporate bureaucracy, law, and, above all, the mass media. Mainstream modern materialism has it that there is no meaning or purpose to reality, and the universe has nothing to do with me. Stuff happens in the world, or it doesn't, for reasons of deterministic causality, or randomness. Things are not going anywhere, except that material processes, mindlessly, unroll and interact. For mainstream modern materialism, things do not add up to any meaning that is relevant to me personally. The universe cares nothing for me personally, neither does my individual consciousness and thinking have any effect on the universe. My mind is just a minor and insignificant part of a vast, impersonal, objective chaos of stuff happening. Starting from some version of the standard normal understanding of things in general, Christianity offers the immediate benefits of understanding that I live in a divine creation which has a purpose and, therefore, meaning. It is going somewhere for real reasons. When I think, when I am conscious, it is against this backdrop of an unfolding story, rather than a chaos going nowhere. Furthermore, divine creation is a story that includes me specifically and personally. Christianity, properly understood, i.e. rooted in Jesus, is always personal. So that when I think, and what I am thinking, is relevant to the whole universe, the whole of creation. Creation is concerned with me, and my thinking and doing has an effect on creation. For the new Christian, life is a drama in which he has a role to play. As he becomes aware of himself and the world, as he becomes aware of his thinking, this personal and particular activity is known to be a significant part of the whole thing. The third of these benefits, the personal aspect, is largely distinctive to Christianity among major religions, although there are, and always have been, self-identified Christians who downplay it to the point of obscurity. The new Christian has an immediate benefit of knowing not only that his life is part of a story linked with creation, but also that his life will not be, as with mainstream modern materialism, a brief and flickering flame lost in the unimaginable space and duration of the universe, but instead his own particular life would be eternal. Nihilism and despair followed by death are the usual consequence of mainstream modern materialism. Christianity is an immediate escape from this and into a life of coherence and consequence. These three psychological benefits are an immediate outcome of becoming a Christian, or, at least, they are benefits for those people who desire that their own lives should have meaning, purpose and universal relevance. Which is, apparently, not everybody, not by any means. For example, by emphasizing the UN understandability, awesomeness, power, remoteness and abstraction of God, rather than the immediacy and knowability and personal relatedness of Jesus and the Holy Ghost. Or by introducing weird and paralyzing philosophical concepts such as predestination, or that time is an illusion, so that, somehow, everything in our lives has already happened. Such ideas obscure, when they do not negate, the essence of Christianity as personal. Of course, many/most people misunderstand Christianity and other religions, especially because they are unwilling or unable to consider the metaphysical assumptions and implications. So, more explicitly, what I am saying here is that Christianity, properly understood, is distinctive in its personal relevance to reality, when compared with other religions, properly understood. Masculinity. William Wildblood. I've noticed among the present generation of young men, those just at the beginning of adulthood, there is a lot of talk about masculinity and how to express that in today's world. I fully understand this. We live in a highly feminized world in which the male is increasingly disenfranchised and almost all expressions of masculinity regarded with disfavor. Any young man must find a way to deal with this. Either he succumbs to it or else he resists it. He can go along with it outwardly but plow his own course anyway, or he can stand out against it and, as it were, assert his rights as a man. The latter reaction is the right one and the healthiest for society as long as it is channeled correctly and does not tip over into aggression, violence, excessive dominance and so on. All the things we know so well, because these extremes of corrupted masculinity, always condemned by any civilized man, have been depicted as masculinity, tout court, by the reigning feminist ideology. From what I gather, current interpretations of masculinity among the younger generation seem to involve various factors ranging from the good, courage, independence and personal responsibility, to the neutral, earning lots of money, to the slightly suspect, spending long hours at the gym in order to build the perfect body. You must know how to fight and also how to lead, so there is a physical side, but there is also a mental and moral side which has to do with authority and command. In the marital sphere they certainly don't want to be led by the nose by a woman, but nor do they want to dominate their woman excessively, though they do see themselves as necessarily head of their household. All that seems reasonable to me. We know this is the natural way of being, and feminism/equality can only exist in a denatured world in which a lot of civilizational fat has been built up which can support this indulgence. The problem as I see it is that there is no or very little mention of God. For there is a worldly masculinity, but there is also a spiritual one. In fact, there might be said to be two spiritual ones. The first is that of the general man who lives in the world. He supports his family, and is the head of his household, but he does this under God. The laws and rules he upholds are those of religion, not his own. This is the normal, traditional way. But then there is the masculinity of those who do not live in the world, not in their minds and hearts anyway. The primary task of these people is to stand for the truth, to assert it at all times and to live it. I am not saying women cannot do this, but it is not their primary responsibility, and since women tend to conform to whatever is around them, it is much less likely they will stand for truth in an era which denies it. Masculinity for the spiritually focused man is not about success and dominance, at least not success and dominance in the world. It is about spiritual values, and this may mean turning the other cheek rather than striking the hardest blow. It may mean sacrifice rather than conquest, and accepting a lesser role rather than ruling. It is not that masculinity is turned on its head, but it is expressed spiritually rather than in a worldly fashion. A blade can be used to kill or to heal, but it is the same blade. I applaud the rediscovery of masculinity. Men should be able to seek and use power responsibly. That is their role, but there are different sorts of power, and there are different ways to use it. Ultimately, everything must be in the service of God and truth, and the most masculine person is the one who goes from self-assertion to self-dominance to self-abnegation to self-transcendence. But he must travel through all these stages to reach the last. God must be partial, for Christians. Bruce Charlton. People through history have wanted God to be everything, to encompass everything, but that cannot be so for Christians. For Christians, God must be partial, because creation has a direction. God is also partial by another meaning of the word, in that the Christian God has preferences. If God is everything, and includes everything, there can be no direction to creation, and thus not point to creation. It just is. And therefore there can be no values, no morality, neither good nor evil, no truth or lies, things merely are what they are, always such and going nowhere else, because there is nowhere else to go, because God is always has been, everywhere possible. The Christian God, however, is going somewhere. Creation is for reasons, for purposes, and embodies values. Creation has purpose, therefore is not complete, is partial. The question is why, then, do so many Christians through history, from very early, try to insist that God is timelessly everything, complete, self-sufficient, etc. Why do they, by this insistence, paint themselves into a corner of contradictions from which they can only mistake by asserting bizarre paradoxes about time and such? Potentially there are many reasons, no doubt, but two I would highlight are that, from one side, early Christian theologians from the Greek and Roman, pagan, traditions already brought with them a ruling abstract concept of deity defined in terms of properties, which they then applied to the personal Christian God. Such a deity was an eternal unity, and philosophical attention was primarily directed at explaining apparent change within this whole, for example explaining illusion within truth, movement within stasis, form within chaos, etc. And from the other, Hebrew, side of Christian history, there was imposed on Christianity an idea of God as an incomprehensible absolutist monarch, who would not tolerate dissent or questioning, and who demanded propitiation. This God required, above all, obedience, service, worship, submission to his will. For mere men to assert that, or even discuss whether, this God was limited in any way, such as that God was partial, incomplete, had desires of restricted power/knowledge/foresight, was felt as a terrible disrespect, a blasphemy, a terrifying act of futile defiance, inviting retribution. For such reasons, Christianity saddled itself with an unsustainable yet dogmatic concept of God as complete. But God is not complete, is partial, and only when God is understood thus does Christianity make human sense. And human sense is what Christianity must make. That is the point of what Jesus said, and did. Note added, the above can also be understood in terms of the development of human consciousness, which occurs through each person's lifespan and also through history. In particular the relationship between the offspring man, and parent, God, as it changes through infancy, childhood, adolescence, and into mature adulthood. The idea of God as complete, and its implications for attitudes and behaviors, is analogous to the way a young child regards his parents, all-powerful, all-knowing etc. This attitude of primary obedience to absolute authority is absolutely appropriate at that phase of development, and also of men in ancient history in relation to God. Indeed, nothing else is possible if goodness is to prevail. But such an attitude to parents is neither appropriate nor good for the mature adult, who archetypally needs to move towards become something more like a loving and committed friend of his mother and father, ideally living, working, raising a family alongside and with his parents, adults among adults. Likewise is such an attitude inappropriate and wrong for modern Christians in relation to deity. As for offspring and parents, so for men and God, best possibilities and good relationships change with development, as men become more conscious, more separated from the group, more potentially autonomous and free. Further note, it may not be clear why I am saying this stuff. The reason is that I believe that false, incoherent, metaphysics has been a major cause of the massive loss of Christian faith all over the West and for a long time. When the foundations are incoherent, the superstructure cannot be strong, even when people are not aware of the nature of the problem. The contradictions of ancient and traditional Christian theology and doctrines are, by now, mainstream and unavoidable. Christians typically either ignore them, or use complex, abstract, false, and, all too often, at root anti-Christian arguments to dispose of them. These arguments are not convincing anybody, least of all those who deploy them, who reveal by their attitude, opinions, behaviors, that they do not believe what they assert sufficiently to be strongly motivated. All the major churches have become net anti-Christian. The genie of doubt, despair and nihilism is out of the bottle, and cannot be shoved back. The status quo ante, the previous state of affairs, cannot be restored because men have changed irrevocably, just as an adolescent is irrevocably different from the child he once was. The only way out of painful and conflicted adolescence is forward into adulthood. Likewise, the only way out from cultural nihilism is through doubt and despair, and out the other side. What comes first, the individual chicken, or the generic egg? Unsatisfactory assumptions behind fundamental moral ideals. Bruce Charlton. It has become really difficult, in practice impossible, to discuss moral questions in the public domain with any degree of precision and honesty. On the one hand, the mainstream modern materialist, MMM, position, which is politically core leftist among all global institutions, and Western nations and groups of nations, parties, major corporations and powerful/wealthy/influential groupings, including thus who are supposedly opposition. This mainstream modern materialism position has now become so nihilistic that any positive and coherent proposition that contradicts it is instantly and effortlessly, by formula, and under centralized control as well as through infiltration, distorted, selected from, pulled to pieces, and used to project malign motivations and nature to any individual or group displaying any degree of opposition from the core agenda. A single remark or image, even from an obscure individual, that strays from the approved narrative, may, at any time, even many years later, be subjected to this open-ended defamatory interpretation until it becomes depicted as an urgent global menace, and its author someone who must be ruined, if not killed. All this from a single, decontextualized, sentence or picture. On the other hand, those who rightly and necessarily resist such demonic destructiveness, are, by our soundbite culture with its tiny attention span, and ultra-simplified thought procedures, drawn into making grossly simplified and generalized statements of truth, that, of course, like any such statement, can immediately be seen to have many exceptions, gray areas and imprecisions. The false claim of mainstream modern materialists, but not adhered to in practice, is that reality consists of an infinite number of special cases, each to be considered on its own merits, implicitly, in terms of a utilitarian emotivist morality that seeks above all to ensure rights or avoid hurt to those minorities who are deemed members of approved victim groups. For the mainstream modern materialism, by far the greatest danger to its supreme values such as social justice, human rights, and to alleviate suffering, comes from traditionalist religious people who treat everyone as exactly the same, and apply to them crude general rules inherited from a benighted past that was characterized by class and caste distinctions, slavery, sexism, racism, imperialism, and so forth. Thus, although the traditional Christian side is mostly correct and the mainstream modern materialism almost entirely wrong, indeed value inverted, in the actual public context such debates appear, to the mass of people, the evil fanatics of the dominating demonic left seem to be more nuances and accurate than their traditionalist Christian opponents, who are, so far as can be seen, fanatically advocating obsolete and simplistic solutions to complicated questions. In reality, traditionalist Christians nearly always recognize the need for nuance and exceptions, and draw a distinction between sinner and sin, what is Christianly right and what is legally mandatory, and many other modifiers to the standardized application of rules to categories. But nonetheless, they do regard it as necessary that a good and valid society operates on the basis of clear and simple principles that can be taught widely and easily understood. Necessary exceptions, valid occasions for turning a blind eye, and mercies, then ought to be exercised at the point of specific enforcement, not principle, by the Christian judgment of those responsible for the implementations of such principle. Yet at a deep and ultimate level, there is indeed a problem with the way that traditional Christianity has conceptualized morality in terms of laws, doctrines, statements, and many Christians do indeed regard these simple generalizations as the bottom line. In other words, they regard divine morality as consisting of simple principles that dictate what everybody should do, and not. In effect, traditional Christianity envisages the true and good universe of reality as structured and ruled by such general categories and principles, with individual people and circumstances fitting naturally within such categories, except for a few individual exceptions, maybe more apparent than real, maybe more a matter of the limits to our knowledge than truly anomalous, that should be dealt with by the minimum of pragmatic or expedient adjustments. In sum, categories and rules come first, and actual individual instances are fitted within these. Such an idea of reality is, in the West, mostly deep-rooted, and derived from in the assumptions of early Greek philosophy, and concepts of law derived from convergence of the law of the ancient Hebrews of the Old Testament, and from the laws of the Roman Empire, through its various developments. Yet, in the end, these are assumptions, ought to be known as such, and tested by each of us for validity. We need to ask ourselves whether it is necessarily correct that the universe is ultimately structured and functions in terms of categories and laws with exceptions. Or whether, instead, as I personally believe, ultimate reality consists of individual beings, living, conscious purpose beings, that can, for particular purposes, be collected into categories and their functioning be understood in terms of types of relationships. Whether, in other words, it seems intuitively and bottom line true that specifics should come first because they are primary, and it is generalities that are secondary, pragmatic, derived. Such a worldview is unfamiliar, and most of us have little experience of thinking in such a way, except within our families, insofar as they are loving and close families. In such families we know that each member is primarily a unique individual rather than a category, and we recognize that our simple rules of thumb by which we manage family life must be rooted in this reality, and therefore must differ as individuals are different, and change as the individuals change. However, even if this is recognized as ultimately true, it does seems unlikely to the point of impossibility that such ways of doing can be scaled up from the family to society at large, to nations and the world. At least, this seems vastly implausible with the world as it now is. But if that genuinely is the reality, i.e. individual beings in relationships, then it is not surprising that public discourse between the leftist atheist demonic mainstream and the demonized Christian traditionalists should have an air of unreality, and be experienced as fundamentally unsatisfactory. While the Orthodox Christians are clearly the better side, and the mainstream is extremely evil to the point of value inversion. Nonetheless, the moral system of advocates of traditional Christian, and other religions, is indeed unsatisfactory at root. Unsatisfactory not merely at the superficial level of simplistic fanaticism into which the media and officialdom artificially distort them, but also unsatisfactory at the deepest level of being based on assumptions that, if we make the effort to identify and evaluate them, we may intuitively feel driven to reject, and reject in exactly those situations we know best and most deeply and are most motivated by love. The weight of entropy. Bruce Charlton. I use the term entropy to describe a very fundamental concept that emerges from an insight, or rather experience, of mankind emerging as self-awareness begins to develop. This insight experience that dates back at least to the ancient Greeks when, it seems to me, it was that which led to the very first philosophy, which was concerned with change versus stasis, movement v stillness, the temporary v the everlasting, chaos v order, the earthly v the divine, illusion v truth, etc. In all these dualities, the first term corresponds with what I am terming entropy. To feel the truth of this realization is rather heavy mass that presses down upon all awareness and thinking. This insight can be described as experiencing the weight of entropy, in other words the realization that everything we know and know of in this world will change and be lost, that, in this world, and for all particular entities, death has the upper hand over life. Not everybody seems to have had this experience, and, it seems, many of those who have had the insight choose to ignore and try not to think about it, or to deny its validity. But for those who have felt the weight of entropy, it has the ring of a profound intuitive truth. It is a metaphysical assumption, hence cannot be proved, but it is consistent with everything in our experience, and nothing has been found in this material world, for example by science, that escapes entropy. Yet, the very fact that we can experience and recognize the weight of entropy in its fullness implies some kind of contrastive possibility, is a kind of proof that it cannot be the whole story, and is not inevitable in some kind of a cosmic sense. My understanding is that we are beings who experience, think, and know from creation, from our innate experience of being part of creation. As original beings, before divine creation, insofar as we had consciousness, our awareness would have been of isolation in a universe of chaos, other beings seeming like aspects of chaos, because they were behaving as such, except we would not have regarded it as chaos, only as what is. It is our inclusion in divine creation, and our experience of loving, cooperating with, other beings, that gives us the basis of something alive and purposive, from which we can experience the workings of entropy dragging us down. And it is also that inclusion within divine creation that provides the awareness of at least a theoretical possibility of escaping, eternally, from entropy. In other words, to feel the weight of entropy is usually a horrible and chilling experience, and it will remain so if we stop at that point, as so many people have, in the modern West. However, if we fully acknowledge the weight of entropy, instead of trying, and failing, not to think about it by distraction, intoxication, dishonesty, etc., then we stay with it and learn from it, we can go through entropy to the other side, which is awareness of divine creation. Note, a similar and related experience of weight is that of sin, the insight that, for all the good in the world, and that it is what many people, apparently, most desire, there is a sense in which sin is cumulative in a way that good is not, and that corruption is an insidious influence that requires conscious and recurrent, if not continuous, resistance. But such an insight is perhaps restricted to some but not all cultures, whereas I suspect that the weight of entropy may occur to individuals in any kind of society. When I read an ancient, or merely old, writer, I feel that I can sometimes recognize whether or not he has had this experience. When present, it seems like mind calling to mind across the ages and between vastly different circumstances. Jesus was a refugee. William Wildblood. Yes, Jesus was a refugee for a relatively brief period when his family went into a neighboring country to escape King Herod. But I don't suppose they received any financial assistance from that country, and nor would they have had a say in how it was run. Furthermore, they returned to their own country as soon as they could. The Holy Family's situation was not parallel to that of most refugees today, which point I only make to show the weakness of the Jesus was a refugee argument made by those who somehow seem to think it can be applied to any and everyone who claims refugee status nowadays, and used in the broader sense to justify the modern phenomenon of mass immigration. Mass immigration inevitably destroys a country. The physical entity will remain. A society of some sort may endure, but it will be nothing like the country that existed before. That is effectively destroyed. You might say time changes a country anyway, but there is organic change and then there is complete revolution. One is growth, but the other is replacement. Mass immigration is replacement. There are no two ways about this. I was brought up in London. The city now is a totally different place with totally different people. Obviously times change, but this is not change. It is radical transformation. You might say this is not a bad thing. It just is what it is. However, the fact remains that London and its people, as they were for a very long time, have gone. People emigrate to a country because they think they will have a better life there, but might it be that human beings are not all the same, and that the people who made the better off country have certain qualities that others do not have, or not to the same degree? That means that any country that undergoes mass immigration will, over time, begin to resemble those countries, worse off, from which the immigrants came. This may not be inevitable if the newcomers can be properly integrated, but the whole point of mass immigration, such as almost all Western countries have endured over the last 2 to 3 decades, is that the excessively large numbers means they cannot be integrated. Then trust between the various communities diminishes to the point that social cohesion starts to dissolve and the sense of nation identity is lost. Jesus tells an often quoted parable about the sheep and the goats in Matthew chapter 25. He relates how the righteous will be rewarded for their good deeds on earth. These include feeding him when he was hungry and looking after him when he was sick. When those so commended are puzzled about this, he tells them that what they did for the least of his brothers they did for him. Note that word, brothers. There is no suggestion that this has a universal application. It surely refers to those who share Jesus' vision of life and whose hearts are set on the kingdom of heaven as opposed to this world. Your spiritual brother is not every other human being, regardless of what he believes and his attitude to life, but those human beings who acknowledge and accept God. This doesn't mean you shouldn't help others when you can, you certainly should, but nor does it mean that a nation is spiritually obliged to have an open door policy. Besides which, personal morality and national policy are not and should not be the same thing. And after all, isn't loving your neighbor primarily to do with loving your neighbor? Mass immigration by its effect on a country is very likely to harm many of your actual neighbors, i.e. fellow countrymen and women, in the sense of putting pressure on house prices, welfare, education and health budgets and many other aspects of life, not to mention the general culture and sense of nationhood. There is a glib, sentimental morality that just looks to the obvious and the immediately pleasing, and there is a more mature and spiritually balanced morality that looks at the wider picture and takes into account the deeper ramifications of a particular act. The fact is that mass immigration has been used as a specific tool, one of several but a significant one, to destroy the West. The West must be destroyed because its civilization and culture were grounded in Christianity. To that end, compassion has been weaponized and turned against itself. I have to say that only the naive and those of bad faith are duped by this, but there are a lot of them, especially in the intellectual classes. These people want to feel morally superior, and so they adopt certain attitudes that will help them do so. They also live in the world of abstract theory as opposed to reality, and thus are easy victims to ideological propaganda which a simpler mindset would see through because it clashes with everyday reality. The Archbishop of Canterbury may have good intentions or think he does, but we know what they say about those. No doubt he means well, but what does it mean to mean well? Does it mean he's doing what he thinks is right or Christian? What if he doesn't know what is right or, indeed, Christian? His Christianity is clearly heavily mixed up with, and I would say confused with, Enlightenment humanism, which was a specific rejection of supernatural Christianity and promoted its social aspect, its least important aspect, to become not just the totality of moral understanding but also to a universal plane. So, the Archbishop may mean well according to his limited grasp of spiritual reality, but his morality is grounded in Enlightenment humanism, rather than Christianity. He is a materialist. The left doesn't like boundaries, but God does. He has created very strict boundaries between spirit and matter, heaven and hell, and even, so esotericists inform us, between the various levels of the higher worlds to which you can only ascend when spiritually qualified to do so. This does not mean that boundaries should never be crossed, but nor should they be totally disregarded. Boundaries protect, and good things need protection in a world in which the darkness is always trying to overcome the light. I am not against immigration per se, but like everything, it depends on the time and the place. It is sometimes right and often wrong, depending on circumstances. A country's first responsibility is to the people who live there. Certainly, if it can, it should extend a welcome to others who may be persecuted in their own lands, but this cannot be an endless process, or the nation will effectively be committing suicide. The Bible says that we should welcome the stranger, but it doesn't say you should carry on doing this until you have destroyed your own nation. This is the disastrous path the West is set upon. A glove puppet on a glove puppet, but who is the puppeteer, scriptwriter, director? Bruce Charlton. Last year I posted a meditation on the philosophical issues raised by glove puppet Hartley Hare's antics in the Pipkins children's TV show of the 1970s, and the Sooty show during the 1990s. The knotty issues were further clarified by W.M. Jastajkanevich. These reference the question of who is morally responsible for the behavior of a naughty glove puppet called Michael, when that puppet is being controlled by another, naughty, glove puppet called Hartley Hare. In the episode, Michael's behavior was blamed on Hartley. But at a deeper level we could say that both puppets were worked by puppeteer Nigel Plaskett. Was he then responsible? Yet Nigel the puppeteer was under the direction of a man called Michael, who told him what to do, including to make the puppets be naughty. And Michael was following a script written by someone else, and all of these professionals were hired by a producer, who was himself an employee of a TV company. And so on. In a world of puppets, who is the real puppet master? To paraphrase the archetypal vicar's sermon, and then I thought, life's like that. Who is morally responsible for the escalating evil that happens in the world, in an ultra-complex and bureaucratic system that is specifically designed to conceal and deny responsibility? Because, in addition to the layers and networks of people telling other people what to do, and themselves choosing whether or not to obey such instructions, we also have voting, committee procedures, precedents, computer, or otherwise automated, decision-making, and many other ways of denying individual responsibility, or eliminating it. And, for Christians, there is a further and invisible, but far more powerful, top layer of supernatural evil beings, Satan and the demons. Given all this, how can we possibly discover where strategies, policies, and specific orders actually come from? The answer is that we can't, even in principle, and even assuming access a breadth and depth of knowledge which we are, in practice, forbidden and blocked. So what then? Does this, as so many people seem to believe, get us all off the hook? Does it mean that we are all puppets living in a puppet show, so that nobody is responsible for anything? And that the world just is so, because we cannot discover the source of evil, to confront and oppose it, we therefore may as well give up on futile agonizing about morality, and get on with doing the evil that apparently must be done. We need to step back and examine the assumptions on which such seemingly inescapable evil expediency is based. We need to be able to understand that in material terms the bottom line is that we are indeed puppets living in a puppet show, and there is no point in pretending otherwise. But it is these material terms that are at the root of the paradox. In other words, if we restrict our analysis of the problem to the assumptions of mainstream modern materialism, then of course nobody is responsible for anything. After all, the assumption of materialism is that everything is either caused by something else or random, so it does not matter how far back we chase responsibility, we can never find it, since we have already assumed it does not exist. Modern society delights in such toils of pseudo-complexity. Rulers use it to get themselves off the hook for evil policies by claiming, correctly enough, within these materialist assumptions, that they were just obeying orders, and that those who gave the order ought to bear responsibility. Only for those who gave that order to claim that they themselves were merely following orders. And the masses too often delight in such arguments, because ultra-complexity seems to exempt everybody from responsibility, as if everybody is merely obeying orders and doing what has to be done, in a single, vast, interconnected closed cycle, with neither beginning nor end. Thus the endless chase to locate responsibility begins, until terminated by the decision to make a convenient scapegoat who is arbitrarily declared to be the one to blame. Then everyone can pretend that something valuable has been achieved. In this sense, the above stuff about glove puppets and bureaucracy is just a red herring, a distraction from the fact that the problem is that we are thinking from underlying assumptions that already deny the possibility of moral responsibility. But understood in spiritual and Christian terms, we are all, to some significant, albeit incomplete, divine beings. We are children of God the Creator, and can / do actually choose to ally or defy God. I mean that we can, must, and do pick sides in the war between God and evil, between divine creation and those who oppose it. We do not need to know where evil comes from nor its complex interactions, only that we are, ourselves, moral beings. We need only recognize evil, take personal responsibility for the evil we do, whatever its ultimate cause may be, then spiritually reject that evil, and instead align ourselves with good. No matter how complicated the world is, and it is, in truth, far more complicated than the largest and most bloated bureaucracies, we should not allow ourselves to become confused by it, because such confusion is itself a tool of evil. Exactly because we inhabit a creation, made for our ultimate benefit by God our Father, whatever really matters and is necessary to our salvation and spiritual development, is always simple, and always doable. Review of Divine Friendship, by William Arkle, a new collection of themed writings. Bruce Charlton. Divine Friendship, an aggregation of Arkle's Analects. Edited by John Flint. Independently published on Amazon Kindle, 2023. 77 pages. Current price, 77 pence sterling, $1. John Flint, who was a friend and collaborator of the author, has edited a short collection of William Arkle's writings on the subject of divine friendship, which was probably Arkle's core theme, the understanding of which can be a key to Arkle's larger philosophical ideas. Arkle is one of a handful of authors that I regard as of primary importance in developing my attitudes and understandings of life and reality. But I am the first to acknowledge that it is difficult to grasp his meaning and significance. Arkle's major work was A Geography of Consciousness, 1974, republished 2019, to which I contributed a new introduction. But Gork is a tough read in parts, with its analogies from physical science and strategy of building up the argument from basic assumptions. The Great Gift of 1977 is much more accessible, with its paintings and poems, yet such is its richness of ideas and images that they are perhaps difficult to navigate and synthesize. John Flint takes the different approach of collecting a variety of forms of communication, spanning more than 2 decades of Arkle's later life, all focusing on the same theme. This theme is that God the Creator most desires from us His children that, eventually, we might grow up to become mature friends that can share in the divine work of creation. Simple to state, but easy to misunderstand, not least because friend has become such an enfeebled concept in this era of social media, and yet the English language offers no alternative better substitute. The collection begins with a verbal transcription taken from an informal live lecture, so we can get an idea of Arkle's conversational style, and of how he explained things person to person. Then there follow relevant excerpts from 4 of his books, the 2 mentioned above, plus Equations of Being, and including the entirety of his self-published pamphlet God, the Player Friend, 1992, which, until now, has been almost impossible to obtain. A further angle is provided by extracts from Arkle's personal correspondence to the editor John Flint, written from 1986 to 1999. I found these very valuable. Indeed, John Flint has previously allowed me to read a much larger selection from this correspondence, which is so good that I have read it at least 4 times through, already. I hope that, at some point, this more complete correspondence between Arkle and Flint might be published in its own right, but in the meantime Arkle's admirers will welcome this taster, and indeed the volume as a whole. Nowhere else could you obtain so much spiritual nourishment for less than the price of a bar of chocolate. The Perilous Necessity of Seeking Enchantment. Bruce Charlton. I have been rereading that most inspiring of essays on fairy stories, by J.R.R. Tolkien, and considering the need some of us feel, in the modern world, for enchantment. Tolkien describes how this can be found in the best of fairy stories, or what we nowadays, since Tolkien's essay, term fantasy literature. But what of real life, of our lives outside of fairy stories? What of our disenchanted mundane lives? Is there any kind of cure for disenchantment, something in addition to our leisure time and recreational immersion in artistic recreations of fairy? What should we do when we awaken from the enchanted realms of a fairy story, and find ourselves back in the mundane world? Such questions are the basis of the romantic impulse, and for people such as Tolkien, and myself, and many others, they are unavoidable and compelling matters. They are matters of life and death. We can try to ignore or drown out the horns of Elfland, the call of enchantment, but we will always be comparing our actual lives with the possibilities experienced in fairy stories. For us, the prospect of life stretching ahead is intolerable without enchantment, so it is not a matter of whether we pursue enchantment, but how. Yet, as Tolkien often emphasizes, this seeking of an enchanted mortal life is perilous, just as true fairy is perilous. He frequently depicted this, most explicitly in Smith of Wootton Major, most pessimistically in his poem The Sea Bell, and it forms the background motivation to the embryonic plot of the Notion Club papers. The fundamental problem is that mortal men in this world cannot attain any good with permanence, because that is the entropic nature of ourselves and the world, and from the fact that such joys are subject to habituation/tolerance/fatigue, so that they cannot be sought directly, and repeated stimuli, use of symbols, rituals, or exposure to artworks, will decline in effectiveness. Many have tried to create for themselves an enchanted life, all have failed. In the end we are up against our own corrupt and limited natures. Many people have ended up in the tragic situation depicted at the end of The Sea Bell, unable to forget, yet unable to attain, fairy, and finding no consolation in the world. A Christian can and should be consoled by the ultimate prospect of resurrected life in heaven, which is, as Tolkien makes clear at the end of his essay, the only possible actuality of that which we glimpse in faerie. It is resurrection that makes the quest for enchantment a matter of truth rather than delusion. Yet, that still leaves the problem of how we structure our earthly lives in the years ahead. Indeed, in this day, and this moment. A further problem is that the consciousness of modern man has developed so as to become so resistant to enchantment, that there seem to be many people who claim not to experience it, not to want it. And there are others who, whatever they claim, seem never to experience any kind of enchantment, but instead seem, so far as I can tell, to live disenchanted lives, to the point of being hostile to the whole idea, and regarding any taint of romanticism as childish, insane or evil. Sadly, many self-identified Christians are of this aggressively disenchanted type, the kind of Christians who regard any whiff of faerie, magic, romanticism as indicating the stench of hellish brimstone, and who regard Tolkien himself as one of the devil's party. I say sadly, because, despite that the quest for enchantment may be personally tragic, not to want it at all, and to regard enchantment as stupid, malign if delusional, strikes me as a kind of self-maimed half-life. I cannot help feeling sorry for such people, even when they are frustrating or maddening to deal with. My best positive suggestion, that I have discussed many times before on this blog, is to apply some of the lessons of Owen Barfield's concept of final participation, which I have further analyzed into concepts such as primary thinking and heart thinking. In particular, the idea that, instead of seeking an overwhelming and immersive experience of enchantment, of faerie, such that we hope to experience being there, inside that world, we may choose to seek to participate with such a world in the realm of purposive conscious thinking. Instead of, mentally, lowering ourselves into enchantment, instead of sinking into a dreamlike realm, we might instead aim to rise above the mundane, to weave our conscious thinking with thoughts of, experiences from faerie. This final participation is not a final answer, because there is none on this side of death, but engaging with an assumed living and potentially present realm of faerie is something that lacks some of the problems of the more usual attempt at traveling into / dwelling within faerie, not least because it is immune to that loss of effectiveness that plagues all attempts to lose ourselves. With the final participation idea, we do not try to lose ourselves or our awareness of this world, but aim instead to remain ourselves, indeed to expand and strengthen ourselves as we encounter enchantment, which can be done by aligning our motivations with that which is good in faerie. Such is difficult because it is a creative activity, and creating justice difficult. Also because it entails the discernment of what is good in ourselves and the enchanted, and working from that. But, however difficult, intermittent, and only partially successful, is such a creative endeavor, it is nonetheless something that provides a very deep level of satisfaction, and a potential for profound learning. So, final participation in faerie seems like a valid life quest for those of us for whom a romantic life is a fact of our natures. When politicians and other leaders do evil deliberately, how come people cannot even comprehend it? Bruce Charlton. This is very evident. On a daily basis, we have reached a point when deliberate evil destruction can work almost unimpeded, because most people have lost the ability to comprehend it. When there is no conceptual place for destructive evil, then, obviously, such evil can't be recognized. This goes beyond the failure to recognize evil in a general sense. Those who analyze, and try to explain and predict, politics, nearly always do so on the basis of self-interest, which is what they understand evil to be. They are keen to point the finger at politicians, parties, pressure groups, organizations who do evil in order to get power, make money, gain status, or indulge their personal desires for sex, drugs, or whatever. This understanding of evil is one that sees it as pursuing private gain, rather than public good, and sometimes as immediate gain rather than long-term benefit. Implicitly, by this view, leaders ought to be altruistic, and pursue long-term public good as their priority, even when, as usual, they can do better for themselves by doing otherwise. But I am talking about the inability even to understand that there is an extreme kind of evil that is primarily destructive rather than self-seeking. This I have called sorothic evil, adapting the term from Rudolf Steiner. The point of sorothic evil being that a spiteful desire to immiserate, harm, and destroy, is stronger than the selfish, self-interested urge. Harm will be done by a sorothic being, even when the self-interested consequence is suboptimal. Indeed, an individual sorothic-dominated being will harm himself, if this is expected to result in sufficient harm to those he hates. My contention is that this kind of evil is currently very powerful, and increasingly dominant in Western powers, and it is very effective for two reasons. 1. Because it is much easier to destroy than to create, easier to break than to mend, to wreck than to build. 2. Because people cannot understand it, sorothic evil can operate undetected, unimpeded. This second reason, the invisibility of sorothic evil, is very important in its power. It means that a very obvious pattern of purposive destruction, wrecking is concealed, because it is broken down into a multitude of presumed self-interests. It also cripples opposition to those who wish to destroy, because opposition to destruction is always fragmented and fighting across multiple fronts, across many single issues, whereas those who are doing the evil are continually opening up new fronts. If we consider the litmus test issues, while sensible but uncomprehending people are laboriously building public resistance to the excesses of Birdemic measures, an anti-racism crusade was introduced. When resistance to this latest insanity begins to accumulate, then the trans agenda is wheeled forward, then the Birdemic peck, then a climate emergency, then a war is started, etc., in random recombinations and cycles, without any obvious limit. Those leaders with the greatest power can keep up this whack-a-mole game indefinitely, due to their control of the system of money/law/coercive force, etc., and those who oppose specifics can never get anywhere in stopping the game. Even the rare successful specific resistances leaves the basic power structure intact, and the sorothic leadership in place. And what is the sorothic nature of these litmus test interventions? Simply that, at the highest level, they need to be understood as destructive in their ultimate purpose. So that while the Birdemic indeed gave some national politicians totalitarian power, and made uncountable trillions of dollars for various parties, its real purpose was destruction of many kinds and at multiple levels, of social cohesion, the money system, economics, trade, transport. And ultimately the destruction of men's souls, by a system of totalitarian/bureaucratic materialism, with the aimed at effect that men choose to disbelieve/reject heaven and, implicitly, to embrace some version of hell. Because when men agree to live by fear, resentment and despair, they have already rejected God, divine creation, and resurrected eternal life in heaven. The same principle applies to all the other major policies of evil. Everywhere in modern culture where there are institutions has been brought within. And that spiritual basis of motivation is exactly why most people cannot understand sorothic evil. At a materialistic level, sorothic evil makes no sense. Indeed, it is not even conceivable, because the built-in assumption is that all evil just is a kind of short-termist self-interest. That is how motivations are understood, so a primary motivation to destroy is simply incomprehensible. Despite that we are all capable of spitefulness, and it is all around us, and people will even admit to it and boast of it, nonetheless our own spitefulness is typically denied, or subject to self-blinding, and that of others explained away in terms of self-interest that everyone understands. Sorothic evil therefore seems irrational, bizarre, far-fetched, incomprehensible, therefore invisible. The idea that there might really and truly be a group of people, perhaps of demonic beings controlling people, who have, for instance, deliberately planned and incrementally implemented a world war, and then are now doing all in their power to escalate it as widely and as fast as possible. The idea that such people would be delighted if, when such a conflict became the ultimate conflagration of tens of millions of sites, that the good earth be poisoned. And the idea that this mass destruction would be done for its own sake. Not for power/money/status or from lustful desires, but done exactly because more and more of their primary litmus test policies means increasingly massive destruction, starving, fighting, maiming/disease/poisoning, killing. The idea that, for instance, an state of total, no-holds-barred, world war might be for its engineers an end in itself, and not merely a means to some other end. Such concepts are apparently beyond the scope of comprehension. They seem just silly, impossible, they make no sense. And that incomprehension is, proximately, exactly how and why such evils happen, and continue to happen. But the reason people cannot understand is deeper, and lethal. It is ultimately a failure to understand evil at all, which comes from a failure to acknowledge the reality of this world, the ultimate nature and purpose of our lives in divine creation. Such a deep deficit in understanding is not fixable by any conceivable actual external pressure, each must do it for himself, or it won't be done. Note added, the current problem seems partly to be an inability, or inner resistance, to imagining sorothic evil. Yet, external observation suggests that almost everybody is prone to this, to some extent. What seems to be required, therefore, is that people look within themselves and reflect on their own propensity to the most negative of evil impulses. Only then may they be convinced of the reality and power of sorothic evil, and able to recognize its fingerprints all over the Western world today. Can the planet Earth choose to be damned, or saved? Bruce Charlton. I have developed the metaphysical assumption that reality consists of beings in relationships. This is a version of the spontaneous, animistic, assumptions of all young children and, so far as is known, hunter-gatherers, including our ancestors. I assume that this is an essentially true way of understanding reality, which is why it was and is innate, built into men, by God. Beings are therefore regarded as the ultimate, fundamental, metaphysically primary units of reality, beings that are alive, with attributes such as consciousness, and purpose. In other words, there are ultimately no things or, more exactly, no knowable things, because chaos is not knowable, it can only be a label for uncreated stuff, including the primordial background state. Ultimately, there is no it, but only him or her, or some other linguistic term that refers to beings. This seems to mean that the spiritual war of this world includes all beings, not just us human beings, but animals, plants, and features of what we refer to as the mineral world, sea, sky, and aspects of the earth, and the earth herself. And as usual, as with humans, there are beings within beings, just as we contain innumerable cells that are beings, for instance the white blood cells which roam our blood and lymph, consuming germs and debris, that are very similar to amoebae. And we men, as individual beings, are also biologically, and spiritually, social animals, with a beingness of some kinds of human groups, that is difficult to conceptualize yet also traditionally regarded as true, and which seems to exist above the individual level. One among many aspects of this situation is that all beings have an analogous choice to that of men, of whether to accept the salvation made possible by Jesus Christ. Whether, that is, to choose resurrection into heaven or not, and thus by default, whether actively or passively, to choose something else. I assume all beings are, in their very different ways, due to their different qualities and degrees of consciousness, able to choose resurrection, or not. And this would apply to that being which is the planet Earth. That there is indeed some such being as planet Earth, I am assuming on the basis that it seems to be spontaneous knowledge, and a feature of many cultures of many kinds through history. This Earth will therefore, like you and me, at some point need to make an eternal commitment to heaven, if the Earth is to become immortal, everlasting, resurrected. And resurrection entails death. Death is the only portal to eternal life of individual beings. So, in order to become part of heavenly life eternal, the Earth, as a being, would first need to die, and must then choose, by an eternal commitment, to be resurrected. The death of the Earth seems inevitable, given entropy, which seems to apply to all material stuff in this reality. And then, after death, will the Earth choose to be resurrected? It seems to me that the Earth will not have made this eternally binding choice to discard all sin and corruption and become everlasting, until after she actually has made this final commitment, because in this mortal and entropic material world, nothing is or can be eternal, including not our choices. Our choices are open to change, to revision, until they are final choices, which happens only after death, when the spirit has separated from the dead body. In conclusion, we cannot know in advance whether the planet Earth as a being will, or will not, be part of heaven, because that final choice has not yet been made by the being that is Earth. This means that the question is still open, and we can be sure that Satan will be trying to influence the choice of Earth, such that she will reject heaven, and by using broadly the same kind of methods that Satan uses against men, to induce men to reject heaven. How might this be working? Well, since the modern era, developing from circa 1500 in the West, and even more since the Industrial Revolution, men have been set against Earth. Men's assumptions include that the Earth is not a being, that it is dead, and can therefore be manipulated and explained as desired. The Earth is not even despised, but is regarded as outside of the drama of creation, because unalive. Atheists do this, Christians do this, modern environmentalists do this. Environmentalists, in particular, have reduced the living Earth to an abstract concept called the environment, which is broken down into a multitude of dead sub-concepts derived from science. Indeed, at present, the environment is in practice being reduced to mathematical models concerned with carbon dioxide, and everything else is ignored or subjugated to these models and their implications. In sum, there are many reasons why the planet Earth might have developed the same kind of sinful, negative, sins that beset modern man. I mean such sins as fear, resentment and despair. We might suppose that such negative attitudes could lead the modern, here and now, Earth towards the same kind of attitudes to God, divine creation and heaven as beset modern men, and might lead to the same salvation-rejecting attitudes as are characteristic of so many modern men. Indeed, it may be that when Christians, or anybody else, but I am addressing Christians in particular, make assumptions about what will happen to the planet Earth, by acting as if the Earth had no say in the matter, they may be making matters worse. When Christians assume that the planet Earth will be resurrected into the New Jerusalem, that heaven will be on some version of this Earth, are they actually taking for granted that the living conscious Earth will do exactly what human beings want Earth to do, and thereby treating the Earth as unalive, just a thing which exists for the convenience of men? Just as if we were to assume that we knew for sure whether some particular human being would necessarily ultimately choose or reject salvation and resurrection, because that outcome is part of our own plans. To speak anthropomorphically, which may not be far from the literal truth, when we think, speak and behave concerning the Earth as an it consisting of things, the Earth knows about this, and presumably does not like it, and may develop negative attitudes in consequence, and yet we continue and increase this way of not relating to the Earth. How many of the troubles of men with natural disasters that we put down to bad luck are actually a direct consequence of the way we regard the earth as a dead it and an unalive thing, and the same for beings composing and dwelling on the earth. Some of the troubles, for sure. If we really dwell in this reality as beings among beings, then such matters are of fundamental importance. I mean recognizing the agency of other beings, and recognizing that each just is responsible for his or her own salvation. It is so easy for us modern men to fall into the evil practice of regarding the universe as a machine, and this is wrong even when what is being assumed is a machine for salvation. We are not components in a mechanism, or elements in a determined plan, and neither is the planet Earth. We are all beings, engaged in a free quest, located in a world which is engaged in spiritual war, a vital aspect of which is relationships. And one primary principle of such relationships is that we recognize each other as beings, not as things. Conversely, it is a plank of the devil's program of damnation, that men cease to do this, and instead habitually, and by conviction, regard the environment, animals, plants and other men, as things instead of beings. Making men into things, and he/she into it, is the malign intent behind such core evil strategies as bureaucracy, totalitarianism, transhumanism, artificial intelligence, the transagenda, and the incremental and coercive computerization and digitalization of life. Beings are not necessarily determined, nor are they random. Instead, beings have natures, dispositions and purposes, can learn, make choices, and until they have made eternal choices, their fate cannot be known in advance. To think and talk otherwise, is choosing to become a component part of the agenda of evil. Note added, on rereading the above, I find it rather unsatisfactorily expressed, and I think this is because I am preaching something I cannot practice, although I want to. For instance, I found several examples, which I needed to edit out, in which I had used it/it's about the planet Earth. Nonetheless, this merely emphasizes how deep and pervasive is this objectivizing and deadly way of thinking. It has even permeated what most adults, and indeed older children, regard as common sense, so that it strikes most people as dumb or insane to acknowledge the livingness and consciousness of the universe and its true components. I myself had to be driven to this conclusion, metaphorically kicking and screaming, via theoretical biology, and the attempt to define life, discuss the origins of life, understand the nature of creativity, and indeed to map the proper boundaries of biology. All of which attempts I found to be impossible without the artificial drawing of boundaries that seemed too obviously arbitrary. When confronted by the dilemma that, therefore, everything must either be alive, or else unalive. In reductionist scientific terms, all of reality is either biology or physics, I felt intuitively compelled to assume the truth of the former, given that the idea that all of reality is ultimately physics, or maybe abstract mathematics, has underpinned the assumptions that have led Western civilization to where we are now. That life consists in irreducible and primary beings, arose from noticing the abstract, and again artificial, nature of any other conceptualization of biology/life/creation. Prophecy, precognition, karma and destiny. Bruce Charlton. For my previous discussions of prophecy, follow this link. When it comes to prophecy, and taking into account the nature of most true prophecies, there is disagreement as to how this is, or may be, possible. Precognition. For some reason, many people seem to regard prophecy as a form of precognition, which entails seeing the future. The idea is that, in some sense, the future has already happened and can therefore be perceived. This would entail that, from here and now, and by common sense analysis, the future is determined, and free will/agency is unreal. This is then explained by positing weird stuff about time, such that there is ultimately no such thing as time. The linear sequential time of our mortal lives in this world is an illusion, and from a divine or real perspective, everything that has happened, is happening or can ever happen, is actually simultaneous. This philosophical idea dates back at least to Plato, and is famously deployed by Boethius to explain the paradox of God's omniscience and man's agency. The question is whether this really is an explanation at all. It posits weird abstract properties of time that are counterintuitive and incomprehensible to ordinary people, leads to the innumerable time paradoxes of science fiction, and purports to explain the specific observation of prophecy by such a vast metaphysical assumption that it explains everything, hence nothing. In essence, it purports to explain evidence with metaphysics, which is the wrong way around. Metaphysics comes first, or should come first. Observations may be consistent with metaphysics, but can neither confirm nor refute it, and changes metaphysics should therefore not be used expediently as a convenient way of accounting for observations. We ought first to establish our metaphysics assumptions, on grounds of intuition and coherence, and then use these to explain observations. My metaphysical assumptions exclude precognition rooted in weird time. Therefore, explaining prophecy by precognition I regard as illegitimate, invalid, not really real. Karma. I use the term karma for the idea that is derived from understanding the consequences of present metaphysics, attitudes and actions. In other words, by knowing and understanding the present situation, it is possible to predict what these will, sooner or later, entail. Thus, we might prophesy that if men believe X, then, sooner or later, this kind of thing will come to pass, or if men do Y, then these will be the effects. Or, as a metaphysical example, if many men's fundamental understanding of reality excludes God and assumes that all of reality is material, then such and such a human society will, sooner or later, happen. Much valid prophecy seems to be of this kind. Destiny. The cause of destiny is that God wills something, and, sooner or later, arranges divine creation so that it happens. The free agency of men, and other beings, may thwart God's will again and again, yet if God continues to provide opportunities for men to choose to do God's will, then eventually some man will make the right choice, and the thing will happen. We can see that the two valid explanations for prophecy, karma and destiny, have no problem about free will or human agency, because they do not state any particular time or date for the fulfillment of prophecy. But as soon as a prophecy is particular and exact, then we run up against the reality of agency, which may tend to thwart such specific prophecy. Presumably, then, in principle exact prophecy can only be real insofar as it has nothing to do with free will or agency, but in a living animistic universe, consisting of beings in relationships, this can never truly be the case, since everything that happens in divine creation must involve the choices of beings. The powers that should not be are putting the people of the world into a position of be destroyed / destroy. Bruce Charlton. The choice is now and increasingly not so much kill or be killed, but be destroyed / destroy. In other words, an evil-motivated large minority of the world has been / is being trained to fear, resent and hate some other group, then these evil-serving groups are being armed, subsidized, organized, and given license to destroy those they have been trained to hate. All this is backed by sheer compulsion. Once they have chosen to fight on the side of evil, the agents of evil will not be allowed to change their minds without themselves suffering destruction. Those who the evil's side haters have been trained, equipped, encouraged and facilitated to destroy, are principally those who are, to some extent, even a small extent, dissenters from the side of evil, especially those who are on the side of God, divine creation and the good. For those on the side of God, divine creation and the good, the choices are not easy. The choice is either 1. Submit to your own destruction. 2. Fight against the agents of your own destruction. But, And here is the evil double bind: in fighting against your own destruction, you will be up against those who hate you, and who will not be allowed to desist from trying to destroy you until either they themselves are destroyed, or else their capacity to destroy you is itself destroyed. Be destroyed, +/destroy, leads to destruction either way. Indeed, to defend yourself, to defend the good results in greater destruction than when good passively allows itself to be destroyed. So, the immediate consequence of taking the side of good is to increase the totality of destruction, and this increase of destruction may be very great indeed, even if the side of good eventually prevails. Yet such a choice is something that will probably come to all who strive to maintain the good in a world where all major institutions are on the side of evil. Indeed, the decision has already come to many people, most of whom appear have chosen to join and assist the side of evil. Which decision the evil servers are not allowed to revoke without consequences. On top of which, the powers that should not be always take care to ensure that the actual job of destroying takes place among the little people. And even among the little people, those who resist evil will be up against not just the orcs, those wedded to evil by their natures, but also many coerced and lied to Dunlanders, Easterlings, Haradrim, that is, up against decent people, brave people, stupid people, who just happen to be doing the work of evil, individually well-meaning, acting on orders, just trying to get by. These agents of destruction will probably see themselves as taking the path of least destruction, choosing the lesser of evils, and the agents of evil will regard the designated victims who resist their own destruction as troublemakers, wreckers, men of violence, bullies picking on the little people. Such is the nature of our times. Such is the karma of this Western civilization, accumulated over many generations, and contributed to by ourselves. Those who look for good in this world, and who equate good with material goods such as peace, prosperity and comfort, will be disappointed. The powers that should not be have engineered the world so that these are off the agenda. To avoid rational despair, and unless we choose and are able to live by delusions and lies, our hopes must be spiritual and located beyond this world, and our faith in these hopes will need to be strong enough to survive and increase without external institutional support. If the digital world, internet, computation, AI etc., are indeed a demonic incarnation, what then? Bruce Charlton. William Wildblood has brought to my attention a pair of articles entitled 4 Questions Concerning the Internet, Part 1 The Universal and Part 2 The Neon God, written by Paul Kingsnorth, in which he independently converges on a theme explored here, also in related blogs and by Jeremy Nadler, over the past few years. Kingsnorth also reaches the same general conclusion, which William Wildblood has articulated lucidly, which is that the internet and computers generally may, in some circumstances, provide a vehicle for the incarnation of demons. If this is regarded as a possibility, which mostly depends on one's metaphysical assumptions concerning the nature of this reality and the relationship of life and matter, then the hypothesis of demonic incarnation in computers explains a great deal, and has extensive implications. For instance, technology is usually presented as value neutral, and whether it is a good thing or an evil would therefore depend on the use to which it is being put. Yet, if demonic incarnation is a reality, then technology may itself become an active and purposive evil. In other words, technology may seek the spiritual harm, including destruction, of men. If we accept this as probably true, in some real but imprecise sense, then what are the implications? Kingsnorth, a recent convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, focuses on the potential for asceticism, for rejecting, denying ourselves, as much as possible, usage of and contact with these demonic entities. Such a strategy has the practical limitation that people just aren't doing this, not even the most ascetic. Kingsnorth describes that even the famously ascetic monks of Mount Athos are, albeit belatedly, often carrying and using smartphones. Then there is the more general problem that it is almost impossible to function in the modern world without a significant level of usage of these possessed technologies. But there is also, and most importantly, the ultimate limitations of asceticism, the deep question of whether this is the proper or best Christian response to the evils of this world. My approach would be rather different. I see the problem of a demonic internet as an extension of the very general problem of evil-affiliated social institutions, a problem that characterizes all major social institutions in the West and globally, including the self-identified Western Christian churches, and a Western convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, still counts as Western. This means that the Christian inescapably lives in a demon-dominated and evil-orientated society, from which there can be no escape while remaining alive and socially functional. But this has, to some significant extent, always been the case, and was surely the case for Jesus himself during his earthly life. Thus Christianity has always, properly understood, for example in the fourth gospel, been rooted and aimed beyond this mortal and social life, and therefore the task for Christians is to deal with the presence of pervasive evil. As I see it, the primary problem of the internet is that people spiritually surrender their values and attitudes to it, and by this they invite evil into their hearts. Evil needs to be invited, and this invitation of evil has become not just a personal corruption, not just a means to ends as in the past, but in Western society here and now evil has been given positive evaluations, officially, by the mass media, legally, economically, etc. We are, for the first time in human history, inhabiting a world where transcendental values of truth, beauty, and virtue are substantially, and increasingly inverted. Since this situation is almost everywhere and cannot be escaped, we must recognize it, and deal with it. Dealing with the internet, computers and digitalization is part of this, but only part. Evil needs to be discerned, identified, recognized, and spiritually rejected, and repented when we have failed to do this, wherever it is encountered. Some of this will surely entail avoidance of internet, computers, AI etc., but as a specific tactic, not as a general strategy. Such a Christian life is not to be envisaged negatively, as a state of siege, ended only by death or the triumph of evil. To accept this understanding would itself be a surrender to the demonic perspective. Because the Christian life is positive, not negative, thus discernment is a byproduct of faith, and faith is about spiritual learning during this life, theosis, as well as resurrection after this life, salvation. In sum, life may be regarded as what it spiritually is, that is, an adventure and a quest. We must therefore engage with evil, and the business of identifying and rejecting evil is a byproduct of our positive spiritual goals. Since God is the Creator, and is good, and loves us each as His child, our personal life situation has been set up, so that nobody can be defeated except by his own choice, and we can all succeed in the end, if that is what we really want to do. So, we should strive not for an ideal of asceticism, but for an ideal of high-hearted and hopeful confidence, with faith that, no matter what the demon-dominated world throws at us, we are equipped to beat it. The Wisdom of the Left. William Wildblood. It's a contradiction in terms, isn't it? Can a left-wing person or a left-wing principle ever be thought of as wise? I don't think so, and the reason is that leftism is an entirely secular ideology. Wisdom is surely a spiritual thing. It must be, as it goes beyond logic, reason and, particularly, ideology. We may talk about the wisdom of crowds, but that is really a misuse of the word. It just means a kind of natural instinct. Even the wisdom of age is just knowledge gleaned from experience. But true wisdom is perception into the heart of spiritual reality, and it cannot be in any way associated with leftism, which only relates to social and economic matters, in other words, worldliness. I realize there exist spiritual and religious people with left-wing views, but I see that as an inconsistency in them, an inability to understand the reality of spirit. It's rather like serving God and mammon. One of them has to fall by the wayside. A spiritual leftist will always have one foot in this world. He is always grafting his spirituality onto his worldliness rather than taking everything from true spiritual perception. I am not saying that the political right is in any way wise. That's obviously not the case, but the point is that wisdom accepts the primacy of the spiritual world, and leftism actually arose as a specific rejection of that. Check your history if you don't believe me. Wisdom is neither left nor right, but leftist principles are a categorical denial of wisdom which is based in the reality of God as God and not as a humanist reconstruction of God. Another point I would make to support this argument is that wisdom is hierarchical, whereas leftism is rooted in egalitarianism. That is almost its defining principle. It leaves out the transcendent, but wisdom derives from knowledge of transcendental reality. This may seem a trivial thing, but I see it as pointing to something very significant, and that is the fundamental emptiness, even in humanity, of leftist thought. It lacks, it cannot ever have, wisdom, and therefore it only touches the most superficial level of the human experience and appeals to the most basic desires and ambitions of the human soul. But today we are ruled by leftist principles. Where are they taking us? Added note, it might be thought that one could write a similar piece putting the word right in place of left, but the reality is that the secular right only exists as an opposition/reaction to the left, which was the initial disruptive ideology and therefore is part of the same anti-spiritual dynamic. However, to the extent that it does seek to preserve some vestiges of spiritual understanding, or what would derive from that, it has some small connection to the ground from which wisdom arises. The psychological nature of mainstream modern metaphysics. Bruce Charlton. In retrospect, I can see that for most of my adolescent and early mid-adult life, I was engaged in the common modern practice of looking inside myself for answers to the chronic life problems of dissatisfaction and alienation. Such is part of a very fundamental assumption, which is very common, that the main problems of life are psychological, and that changing our assumptions and attitudes is the way to cure them. Because this is a fundamental, i.e. metaphysical, assumption, it cannot be disproved by experience, because it is itself the way that experience is structured. For instance, the ancient Greek philosophers seem first to have articulated the fundamental problems of change, which I often term entropic, that is disease, aging and death. For the ancients these were what needed to be explained, and they were dealt with by assuming some other mode of reality that was not subject to these kinds of change. The same applies to some religions, including Christianity, which assumes that entropic problems are fundamental to this mortal life, but can be solved by resurrection into heaven. Other religions solve entropic problems by positing a perfection of changeless bliss, which is real, whereas entropic change, as we experience it, is either an illusion, or at least merely temporary, hence less fundamental. But all of these regard entropy as a problem of existence, not of psychology. However, for mainstream modern man, these are reframed as psychological problems. A disease is not necessarily disease, nor is aging. These can be reframed by a change of attitude. The problems of disease and aging are seen as being caused by attitudes to them, and the solution of problems of disease and aging is therefore to change these attitudes. Sex, male and female, is not fundamental, but can be reshaped open-endedly by the spread of different attitudes. These assertions are not disprovable, within the assumption that psychology is fundamental. Even death has, often, been reframed by such ideas that death is not part of life, therefore not our concern, or that, it is assumed, we won't be there to experience death, so we shouldn't worry about it. Or asserting that we can know nothing of death, therefore we should ignore the subject, and we will, presumably, find out later, whether there is anything to worry about or not. In sum, the usual modern idea is that psychology is real, but nothing else is real, and when there are problems, these are psychological problems, and have psychological solutions. This constitutes much of current politics. Even science is now defined in terms of a consensus, a psychological process, between persons/committees who are accorded, by a decision, by psychological mechanisms, the authority to form binding consensus. It is futile, therefore, to argue that even death/sex or disease is a fact of life in a system that regards only psychology as real, and where the realities of psychology are part of the system. It is, like all systems, closed and circular. All justifications come from within the system, and nothing out with the system is relevant, because anything out with is unconceivable within the system. And why the system has landed on psychology as the ultimate nature of reality is a question and can only be asked from outside the system. This is not a problem, except that the only coherent way to reject the system is to reject it as a whole, and its valuations. Reality can be understood on the basis of other assumptions, but we aren't going to get these from the system. We must do this for ourselves. Which is something that Christians have reason to believe that we can do, each as an individual, because even without the system to feed us its approved attitudes, we are not alone, but are actual children of God. And the Christian God is understood to be creator of the real system, therefore out with the system of psychological explanations. By what mechanisms might demons influence computers or the internet? Bruce Charlton. Demons are living, conscious, purposive immaterial spirit beings, but computers are regarded as non-living material objects made of minerals, performing electrical and digitally segmented procedures. How can demons influence, say, the internet? This seems difficult, or impossible, to understand because, with the usual assumptions included in the question, we seem to be suggesting that immaterial living spirit can, somehow, affect solid, dead matter. We are falling back into asserting an incoherent or paradoxical ghost in the machine scenario. As usual, the problems are with false assumptions, assumptions that intrinsically prejudge and have excluded the very possibility under question. Instead, these are some assumptions about reality which I take to be true, and which make sense of the idea of demons influencing the internet directly, by incarnating into computational systems. 1. The spiritual is primary, and the material is a subset of the spiritual. In other words, matter might be pictured as somewhat like condensed spirit. This means that all matter is spiritual, necessarily, and unavoidably. So there is no problem about spirit affecting matter, because all matter is within spirit to start with. 2. The spiritual world exists as beings, is organized as beings, which are living, conscious, purposive entities. So everything we might assume is a thing is instead actually either itself a being, or part of a being. So each man is a being, but, for instance, man's bones or veins are, apparently, not beings, but are parts of a being. If a tree is a being in its own right, maybe a mushroom is part of a larger being, containing many mushrooms linked underground. A mountain might be a being, perhaps, or it might be part of a being that is an island, a continental plate, or the earth. We don't usually know the boundaries of beings nor how they are organized, so I am simply illustrating the principle. 3. A being can form part of a larger being, and often includes smaller beings. Men are beings that contain beings. An example might be a white blood cell in our blood, which, we might imagine, has no idea that it is part of a human being, but simply lives out its life in hunting cellular debris or invading germs, eating and assimilating them, reproducing, etc. And men, as beings, are contained by other beings. For instance, a man, whose life and activity forms part of a larger human grouping, a tribe, or maybe a nation about which he may be ignorant and which uses his abilities and labor for its own purposes. This means that a larger being, containing men, must be genuinely real, not just a convenient metaphor, and is typically a spiritual, not material, being. In the past this was, when the man-containing being was good, conceptualized as a presiding angel. When the larger being is evil, it is a demon. Both might, and typically do, exist, contesting over the component men, for example a national archangel versus a globalist demon, varying in dominance through time, and each group angel/demon using different men, for different roles, and different selective aspects of those men. What is happening here is that only a part of each component man is truly a component of the larger being, that is the tribe or nation or whatever group it may be. The man's essential being is not a part of any larger being, but may choose to affiliate with or reject that larger being and its purposes. What happens is that some of that man's attributes are in fact being organized into a larger unity, while the essential being is eternal and cannot be assimilated into any larger being, but necessarily stands apart from all possible systems, and decides whether or not to join with them. From the perspective of the larger being, the component smaller beings are organized into hierarchical and specialized functions, and used to perform particular tasks in particular sequences, analogous to the parts of an army, each operating under orders. Putting together the above three assumptions, we can see that the agenda of evil might be administered overall by a being such as Satan, who is analogous to a general directing lower ranks towards a particular strategy. These lower ranks might include demons participating in a hierarchy of organized and specialized functions. The lower ranks also include men, and other beings and parts of beings such computers, programs, the internet. While demons are supposed to be wholly committed to evil by their natures, the men who participate in the system of evil are only partially being used for that purpose. So a man might regard his job as just digging holes and building walls, or collecting and summarizing data in an office, and this activity might be integrated into an evil-orientated agenda, or a good and godly one, and to varying degrees. Yet the situation is not static, and evil operates purposively to increase itself and corrupt other beings, so the man in an evil-aiming organization who digs holes, or the one that deals with information, might be confronted with links between his activity, and its aims and consequences. So that he will become aware of his participation in evil, and then needs consciously to decide whether to endorse or repent this participation, each of which will have different consequences for how much of himself participates in the system. E.e. If an aware man then repents his participation, corruption does not proceed. If he refuses to repent and regards his evil as good, he will be embracing the value inversions of evil, then that man will become more positively orientated towards evil goals. Anyway, to return to the original question of how demonic evil might use the internet to pursue its goals, we can see that there are multiple potential mechanisms, operating at all levels. And bearing in mind that the spiritual is primary, and the material a manifestation of spirit. Planning the organizations which comprise units of demons, men, and other beings/parts of beings such as computers and their programs. Personnel decisions about which particular individuals or units are performing specialized functions within these systems, by directing the flow and sequence of tasks. There is the administration of these organizations, filtering their inputs and outputs, emphasis given to selected outputs, etc. Once any evil entity is within any organization, and that organization is regarded as running on the basis of uninfluenceable material processes, then evil-orientated choices of evil-affiliated beings will operate to increase the power of evil within that organization. As always, insofar as it is purposive, the demonic agenda is, to some variable extent, either consented to or chosen by those who participate. Genuinely unwitting participation is possible, but since this is not corrupting, it is regarded by the ruling evil entities as merely a temporary phase, a means to the end of corrupting a being. Sooner or later, individuals participating in evil will be brought to awareness of the goals and direction of their role, and this moment will be engineered such that the individual is likely to conceptualize the evil he is doing as, inversely, actually a higher type of good. As when architects are induced to embrace deliberate ugliness as actually a higher, more sophisticated kind of beauty, or politicians embrace the big lie as in service to a higher truth, such as social justice, or when the enforced mutilation and poisoning of children is justified as part of a more profound ethic of choice, liberation and inclusion. In other words, demonic influence does not need to happen by such weird/spooky ideas as a demon putting his spiritual thumb into a software process to shape a particular outcome. Although, insofar as the electrical instantiation of a software process is a material part of primarily spiritual reality, material action will manifest in accordance with spiritual realities, and then the outcome of processing will not be explicable within the system, and will be put down to some unknown random error or failure. In other words, the material is never independent of the spiritual, and the spiritual is always controlling the material. The material elements of computers or the interest are already and always part of the life of primarily spiritual beings, so, to posit their being subject to net evil orientations is merely to assert that demonic spirits have become dominant, overall, in that particular aspect of this created earth. Note, this is why mainstream modern materialism, which fundamentally misunderstands evil and denies the reality of demons, leads inevitably to an incremental corruption of society. Once a demon has gained entry anywhere, and this is inevitable, sooner or later, he can operate undetected, his identity will be denied, and his effects explained away as random errors or incompetence. This may be one reason why it was possible for prophets of the past to predict these end times.